The road to Black Hollow twisted like a serpent through miles of dense, ancient woodland. Trees, gnarled and skeletal, reached toward the sky with withered limbs, their bark peeling like rotting flesh. The air was thick with decay, the scent of damp earth mingling with something more acrid, something old, forgotten. At the heart of this forsaken wilderness stood Evermere House, a structure so deeply embedded in local legend that even those who had never set foot near it spoke its name in hushed tones. Some said the house was cursed, that the walls had absorbed decades of pain, grief, and something darker, something still alive within the rotting timbers. Tonight, Evermere would welcome its first visitor in over a decade, and the house remembered. Lena Graves tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car's headlights carved weak tunnels through the swirling mist. The road had narrowed to a single lane, and the trees pressed closer, their spindly branches scraping against the metal roof like grasping fingers. She exhaled slowly. The inheritance papers lay on the seat beside her, a legal confirmation that Evermere House now belonged to her. Her grandmother's final words had been cryptic. "The house is waiting, Lena. It never forgets." She dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying woman, until now. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, rusted and half buried in creeping ivy. As her car rolled to a stop, something stirred beyond the threshold. A faint creak, like old wood shifting, or a whispering breath. She stepped out, the night swallowing her whole. Evermere was a monolith of decay, its once grand facade now consumed by neglect. The porch sagged, vines choked the stone walls, and the windows, tall and unblinking, gazed into the night with empty sockets. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew, but beneath it lingered something metallic. Blood? Number just rust. Just time. Lena pushed the front door open. It resisted, groaning like an injured thing, before surrendering with a final reluctant shriek. Inside, dust motes floated in the weak glow of her flashlight. The entryway was cavernous, lined with walls scratched and pitted, as if something had clawed at them in desperation. A grand staircase spiraled into darkness above. The silence was too deep, too knowing. The house had been abandoned for over a decade, yet the air felt stirred, awakened. Lena inhaled sharply as a door down the hall slammed shut, a sharp, echoing bang that shattered the stillness. Someone, or something, was here. As the hours dragged on, Evermere's presence grew heavier. The walls shifted when she wasn't looking. Footsteps echoed from the second floor, yet she was alone. The furniture bore signs of movement, chairs slightly askew, an old lamp flickering though it was unplugged. And then, there were the whispers. Late into the night, as she sat by the dying fire, the murmurs began. Faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. Then closer, more urgent. "Get out!" Lena's blood turned cold. The voice was right behind her. She turned, only shadows. But the air had changed. It was charged, electric, as if unseen eyes now watched her every move. By the second night, Lena discovered the locked door at the end of the hall. A massive, iron-bound thing, its surface scorched as if fire had tried and failed to consume it. The key, found beneath a loose floorboard, fit perfectly. The door groaned open. The room beyond was wrong. The walls pulsed, slick with something dark and wet. The ceiling breathed, sagging and rising like the chest of a sleeping beast. And the floor. The floor was stitched together with something pale and human-looking. At the center stood a cradle, rocking though no wind touched it. Inside, something shifted. Something woke up. Lena slammed the door shut, her heart hammering. The house shuddered around her, a deep, guttural groan of displeasure. She wasn't supposed to see that. That night, the dreams came. She saw Evermere before its decay, a grand estate filled with people, laughter, and opulence. But beneath it all, a secret, a hunger. The house had not always been empty. It had been fed. In her dream, the guests sat at the long dining table, smiling, faces half rotted, their hands fused to the silverware. The food was moving, squirming. Then the host turned to her. His eyes were black pits. "You are the last, child, and the house must feed." She woke to the sound of something massive slithering through the walls. She should have left. Instead, she followed the sounds, down, down, into the guts of Evermere. The basement was vast. The walls quivered, wet and glistening. Bones protruded from the mortar, human teeth embedded in the stone. And at the center of the room, a pit. A yawning, endless maw lined with writhing tendrils, slick with blood and bile. Lena staggered back as the walls began to close in. The whispers became screams. Hands, decayed, skeletal, burst from the walls, dragging her toward the pit. Evermere had waited. Now it would feast. The next morning, Evermere stood silent once more. The car was still parked at the gate, its driver gone. Inside, the dust had settled. The air was still. But in the walls, something new had joined the whispers. A soft voice, begging, screaming. The house had fed, and it would wait again. Because Evermere never forgets. The letter arrived on a cold autumn evening, its edges crisp and yellowed with age. Daniel Mercer traced the ink with his fingers, an invitation to Black Hollow Manor, an estate abandoned for decades. The sender was unknown, but something about the letter tugged at his curiosity. "You are requested to return. The house remembers." Daniel hadn't set foot in Black Hollow since childhood. He barely recalled the events of that time, only fragments. Shadows in the halls, whispers in the walls, his mother's voice warning him never to return. Yet here he was, staring at an address long erased from maps. With nothing holding him back, he packed a single bag and set out for the forsaken estate. Black Hollow Manor loomed at the end of the road, its facade cracked and withered. The iron gate stood ajar, swaying slightly despite the still air. As Daniel approached, the sound of dry leaves crunching beneath his boots was swallowed by silence. The house was wrong. The walls seemed to pulse like something alive, breathing. The windows, hollow and black, watched him approach. The front door opened on its own with a slow, agonized creak. Inside, dust floated in the amber glow of candlelight. The air smelled of mildew and decay. Footsteps echoed above, but the house was supposed to be empty. Daniel wandered the halls, each step feeling heavier, as if the floor were trying to swallow him. The paintings on the walls had been defaced, faces scratched out, eyes gouged away. The air pressed against him, thick with something unseen. In the sitting room, an old phonograph played a warped tune on its own. A chair rocked back and forth, though no one sat in it. Then came the whispering. It started low, seeping through the walls, the words unintelligible yet familiar. Then he saw it, his own name, etched into the wood of the grand staircase. Beneath it, another name, Eleanor. Memories surfaced. Eleanor was his sister. But Eleanor had died. Hadn't she? The whispers guided him upstairs to a door at the end of the hall. It was locked, but his hand trembled as it touched the knob. The key was in his pocket. He didn't remember picking it up. The door opened with a shudder, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. The furniture was untouched, save for the thick dust covering everything. Dolls sat in neat rows on a shelf, their button eyes watching. The bed was made, and at its center lay something impossible. Eleanor's favorite stuffed rabbit, pristine and untouched. A giggle echoed behind him. The door slammed shut. The whispers grew into voices. A child's laughter. Eleanor's voice calling his name. The walls trembled as the air grew colder. Shadows pooled beneath the furniture, stretching toward him. Then he saw her. Eleanor stood in the corner, her face hidden in shadow. But something was wrong. Her limbs were too long, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Her voice was familiar, but it didn't belong to her anymore. "You left me." Daniel stumbled back. Memories clawed at his mind. Eleanor had been trapped here. Not dead. Trapped. And now, she was no longer alone. The floor beneath him split open. Darkness swallowed him whole. Daniel awoke in a cavern beneath the manor. The walls pulsed, slick with something black and alive. The air was thick with the stench of rot. He wasn't alone. Figures stood in the darkness, their faces familiar yet warped. Memories made flesh. His mother, his father, Eleanor. "Stay with us," they whispered in unison. The house didn't just remember. It fed. It had been waiting for him to return, to finish what had been started long ago. A choice lay before him: run and risk becoming part of the house's memories, or stay and embrace the horror that had once been family. Daniel ran. The house howled, its walls closing in. Hands reached from the darkness, clawing at him. The stairs stretched endlessly, the door to freedom just beyond reach. Then Eleanor appeared before him, her form twisted, eyes hollow. She raised one hand, whispering a single word: "Stay." For a moment, he hesitated. Then he wrenched the door open and fell into the cold night. Black Hollow Manor loomed behind him, but the whispers were gone. The house had let him go. But as he turned to leave, the final horror revealed itself. His shadow, cast by the moonlight, was no longer his own. It was Eleanor's, and it was smiling. Months later, another letter arrived at a stranger's doorstep. "You are requested to return. The house remembers." Daniel never spoke of what happened at Black Hollow Manor. He moved to a city far from the ruins of his past, changing his number, avoiding old acquaintances, and pretending none of it had ever happened. But he knew the house wasn't done with him. At night, he heard it, the whispers crawling through his walls, slipping into his dreams, speaking in his sister's voice. The shadow that wasn't his own stretched too far in the streetlights, watching him. Then, one evening, he found something in his mailbox, a letter, yellowed and brittle. "You cannot run. The house remembers." The ink bled into the paper as if alive. His fingers trembled. The scent of mildew and old wood filled his apartment. The room darkened, shadows pooling in the corners. Something was here. He turned, and for the briefest second in the reflection of the window, he saw her. Eleanor, standing just behind him, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her empty eyes staring. The lights flickered. Then the room went black. Daniel woke gasping, his sheets damp with sweat. The room was silent, but something felt wrong. He threw off the covers and froze. The wooden floorboards beside his bed were engraved with the same words from the letter: "The house remembers." His breath came in ragged gasps. He hadn't been dreaming. The days blurred, the city's lights dimmed, streets unfamiliar. People passed without seeing him, their faces blurred like smudged ink. The world felt thinner, as if reality itself was wearing away, and the shadows were getting closer. Desperate for answers, Daniel returned to Black Hollow. But where the manor once stood, there was nothing. Just an empty field, shrouded in mist. Confusion turned to dread. He stepped forward, and the ground gave way. He fell, tumbling into darkness. When he landed, he was inside the manor again. The walls pulsed. The whispers came from all around, and in the center of the room stood Eleanor, her back to him. "You never left," she said, her voice wrong, layered, like many voices speaking at once. Daniel stepped backward, but the floorboards bent like flesh beneath his feet. He looked down. His feet weren't on wood. They were standing on faces, hundreds of them, mouths open in silent screams. The air thickened, pressing down on him like a living thing. The house was alive, and it was starving. A single door appeared at the end of the hall, its surface covered in deep, claw-like gouges. He didn't want to open it, but something pulled him forward. His fingers brushed the handle, and suddenly, a surge of memories crashed through him. He saw himself as a child, standing at this same door. Eleanor was behind it, pounding and screaming. He had locked it, left her there, and walked away. The truth hit like ice. Eleanor hadn't been taken. She had been trapped. By him. His stomach twisted as the door creaked open, and what stood on the other side was not his sister. The creature stepped forward. It wore Eleanor's form, but it was wrong. Her limbs were too long, her joints bending the wrong way. Its mouth split into a grin that stretched too far, its teeth needle-sharp. "You left me," it whispered. Daniel stumbled back. He had done this. He had abandoned her. The thing lunged. He turned and ran. The halls twisted, leading him deeper. Every door opened to the same room, a mirror of his childhood home, rotting, decayed. Then, he saw it. A mirror. His reflection was wrong. It wasn't him. It was Eleanor. And she was smiling. "Come back," she whispered. The room melted. The walls turned into writhing black tendrils that reached for him. The house was devouring itself, and he was inside it. Daniel's screams echoed through the void. Then, silence. He opened his eyes. He was standing at the entrance of the manor. The sky was clear. Birds chirped. Had it all been a nightmare? Then he looked down. The ground was soft, like flesh. His own footprints were not his own. Far away, in another town, a woman found an old envelope in her mailbox. It smelled of mildew and old wood. "You are requested to return. The house remembers." She turned it over. It was signed, in faded ink, with Daniel Mercer's name.